Okay, so today I'm going to record pages 63 through to 66 of chapter 10 of Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case, chapter 10 of Jekyll and Hyde. So between these two, I now felt I had to choose. Now remember, this has been a big kind of key theme in the whole book about choosing between the ideas of good and evil. My two natures had memory in common. Just remember a reminder that Jekyll and Hyde share memory, okay, so they can remember which each one has done. But all other faculties were most unequally shared between them. Jekyll, who was composite, as in a mixture of good and bad, now with the most sensitive apprehensions, now with the greedy gusto. Now, gusto means kind of like enthusiasm. Projected and shared in the pleasures and adventures of Hyde. But Hyde was indifferent to Jekyll. So the relationship between them is quite complicated. Jekyll enjoys what Hyde does and he shares in these pleasures, while Hyde is indifferent. He thinks that Jekyll was a bit of a drag. All but remembered him as the mountain bandit remembers the cavern in which he conceals himself from pursuit. Jekyll had more than a father's interest. Hyde had more than a son's indifference. So Stevenson makes a really excellent comparison here between the relationship between Jekyll and Hyde being like a father and a son, and that's already kind of propped up a bit in the book earlier. But Jekyll being the father, Hyde being the son, and this idea that Jekyll's a father who wants to be really interested in what his son's doing, but Hyde is indifferent. He doesn't really care what his dad thinks. To cast in my lot with Jekyll was to die to those appetites which I had long secretly indulged and had of late began to pamper. To cast it in with Hyde was to die to 1,000 interests and aspirations and to become at a blow and forever despised and friendless. So he feels he's in a bit of a catch-22. He either becomes Jekyll and he becomes like a slave, like he says here, to die to those appetites that he'd long secretly indulged, so the things that he's been getting up to as Hyde, or he'll become despised and friendless. So it's difficult. It's a debate really about which one is the better kind of way forward for him. The bargain might appear unequal, but there is still another consideration in the scales. For while Jekyll would suffer smartingly in the fires of abstinence, as in abstinence here means abstaining from things, not doing what he likes. That usually we use the word in modern context often with alcohol. If we abstain from alcohol, it means we don't drink it. So Jekyll would suffer smartingly in the fires of abstinence. Hyde would not even be conscious of all that he had lost. So there's an interesting idea that Jekyll would be aware of kind of giving up the things that he wants to do, while Hyde wouldn't even be conscious of what he'd lost because he doesn't care about Jekyll. Strange as my circumstances were, the terms of this debate are as old and commonplace as man. So again, just linking to the key themes of the book, this book is about kind of humanity and what it means to be a person, the good and bad within us. Much the same inducements and alarms cast the die for any tempted and trembling sinner, and it fell out with me, as it falls with so vast a majority of fellows, that I chose the better part. So he chooses Jekyll, and was found wanting in the strength to keep it. So he chose himself to be Jekyll, but he found it difficult. He was found wanting, found it difficult to actually be this good man. Sometimes it's true, isn't it? Everyone struggles sometimes to be good all the time. It takes effort to be a good person. It doesn't just happen naturally. And clearly for Jekyll, who's experienced doing whatever he liked, he obviously finds it quite difficult to sort of restrain himself. Yes, I preferred the elderly and discontented doctor. So note that word discontented, which means unhappy really. So he chose to be the kind of unhappy doctor, surrounded by friends and cherishing honest hopes, and bade a resolute farewell to the liberty, the comparative youth, the light step, leaping pulses, and secret pleasures that I enjoyed in a disguise of Hyde. So he gives up all these things, this freedom, this youth, this light step, this kind of leaping pulses, like his heart rate has been up as Hyde. and these secret pleasures. And again, I wonder if this is to do with sex. I made this choice perhaps with some unconscious reservation, for I neither gave up the house in Soho nor destroyed the clothes of Edward Hyde which lay ready in my cabinet. So an interesting point there. There was some unconscious reservation. It's like someone giving up smoking, but instead of throwing away all their cigarettes, keeping them in the drawer somewhere so they're always there if they want to go back. That's the same thing. He's kept this house in Soho and he hasn't destroyed the clothes of Hyde, so if he wanted to return, he can. So he's almost like not fully giving up being Hyde. For 2 months, however, and it's quite an important period of time, however, I was true to my determination. For 2 months, I led a life of such severity as I had never before attained to. By severity, again, he means kind of restriction. And enjoyed the compensations of an approving conscience. But time began at last to obliterate the freshness of my alarm. So time is destroying his kind of resolve. The praises of conscience began to grow into a thing, of course. I began to be tortured with throes and longing. So he feels kind of mentally tortured about longing to do things. As of Hyde struggling after freedom. And at last, in an hour of moral weakness, moral, by the way, meaning kind of like good and bad, I once again compounded and swallowed the transforming draught. So he doesn't last long as Jekyll. He becomes Hyde again. 2 months he gives it up, but like he's almost like like an addict. He's addicted to being Hyde and doing whatever he likes. And like he said, it was like Hyde was struggling within. I do not suppose that when a drunkard reasons with himself upon his vice, he is once out of 500 times affected by the dangers that he runs through. Just going to make sure that's a bit easier to see. He is once out of 500 times affected by the dangers that he runs through his brutish physical insensibility. Neither had I, long as I had considered my position, made enough allowance for the complete moral insensibility and insensate readiness to evil which were the leading characters of Edward Hyde. So he's saying that because he kind of gave up being Hyde for so long, he kind of forgot about how morally insensible and kind of insensate, which means kind of like insensitive, cruel, he was ready for evil. That were the leading characters of Hyde. Hyde is all about being evil. Yet it was by these that I was punished. This is a great quote. My devil had been long caged, he came out roaring. So because the longer he stopped being Hyde, he actually made it worse for himself, because when Hyde is unleashed, he comes out roaring like some kind of animal. Again, some sort of zoomorphism there. Zoomorphism, remember, is when we turn like a human being into an animal. I was conscious, even when I took the draught, remember that's the sort of potion, of a more unbridled, a more furious propensity to ill. And ill means like ill harm, again, ill often means evil. It must have been this, I suppose, that stirred in my soul that tempest of impatience, like a storm of impatience, with which I listened to the civilities of my unhappy victim. I declare at least before God, no man morally sane could have been guilty of that crime upon so pitiful a provocation, and that I struck in no more reasonable spirit than that in which a sick child may break a plaything. But I had voluntarily stripped myself of all those balancing instincts. So remember, voluntarily, he's chosen to become Hyde, and he stripped himself of everything that keeps him being good, these balancing instincts, by which even the worst of us continues to walk with some degree of steadiness among temptations, and in my case, to be tempted, however slightly, was to fall. And this idea of falling is quite a big idea and kind of tragedy. And there is a tragic element in Jekyll and Hyde, and just like Macbeth fell from grace, Jekyll falls when he becomes Hyde, especially when he loses control. Instantly the spirit of hell awoke in me and raged. With a transport of glee, I mauled the unresisting body, tasting delight from every blow. So we now get the perspective, and this is one of the key functions of this chapter. We're getting Jekyll's perspective and everything. This is the murder of Carew from earlier in the book. And it was not till weariness had begun to succeed that I was suddenly, in the top fit of my delirium, struck through the heart by a cold thrill of terror. So he kind of feels this kind of thrill of terror. And he's committed murder. So he's committed the kind of worst crime that he's committed as Hyde in all this time. A mist dispersed. I saw my life to be forfeit, as in kind of like fake. Also forfeit, also given up, like surrendered to perhaps a life in prison, because if he gets found for murder, he will be in prison for the rest of his life, and perhaps actually executed. Might be hanged for doing that. And fled from the scenes of these excesses, at once glorying and trembling, my lust of evil gratified. Gratification is interesting. It's like an interesting idea of being like satisfied. Gratification is like when we feel satisfied and stimulated. My love of life screwed to the topmost peg. I ran to the house in Soho. Interesting that, isn't it? I've never noticed that before. My love of life screwed to the topmost peg. It's like his love of life is actually quite high after this thrill of murder. Interesting. I ran to the house in Soho, and to make assurance doubly sure, destroyed my papers. Thence I set out through. So he destroys. We actually saw that when Utterson and the inspector went to his house, there were lots of destroyed papers in their house. Thence I set out through the lamplit streets in the same divided ecstasy of mind. So he's divided between kind of how awful it was, but how kind of he got joy out of killing this man. Gloating on my crime, lightheadedly devising others in the future, planning other murders. He's got a taste for murder. And yet still hastening and still hearkening in my wake for the steps of the avenger, perhaps the police. Hyde had a song upon his lip as he compounded the draught, and as he drank it pledged the dead man. So he, that's quite cruel, isn't it? He makes a kind of toast to the dead man, to Carew, as he takes the draught. The pangs of transformation had not done tearing him before Henry Jekyll, with streaming tears of gratitude and remorse, so he's thankful now to be himself again, and he's full of remorse, had fallen upon his knees and lifted his clasped hands to God. Remember, characters in this play, when they're desperate, they turn to the big man, they turn to God. The veil of self-indulgence was rent from head to foot. I saw my life as a whole. I followed it, so his whole life flashed before his eyes. I followed it from the days of childhood, when I had walked with my father's hand, this kind of innocence. As he held his father's hand as a child, he never would have killed someone. And through the self-denying toils of my professional life, the kind of work of his professional life, to arrive again and again with the same sense of unreality at the demand horrors of the evening. I could have screamed aloud, so he's so full of despair that he's murdered someone. How could he possibly do this? I sought with tears and prayers to smother down the crowd of hideous images and sounds with which my memory swarmed against me, and still, between the petitions, the ugly face of my iniquity, which is a crime, stared into my soul. So this is kind of shaking him to the soul. He's actually been able to kill someone. As the acuteness of this remorse began to die away, it was succeeded by a sense of joy. So there's some clear juxtaposition there. We've got remorse juxtaposed with joy. The problem of my conduct was solved. Hyde was thenceforth impossible. So I can't be Hyde anymore. It's impossible to be him. I kill people. Whether I would or not, I was now confined to the better part of my existence, and oh, how I rejoiced to think it. With what willing humility I embraced anew the restrictions of natural life. With what sincere renunciation I locked the door by which I had so often gone and come, and ground the key under my heel. So he destroys the key. Remember, we saw that in the last chapter. Chapter 8. Utterson found this key, and they were confused. And now we get the answer. And remember, this chapter, that's the function. It answers all the questions that have been raised earlier in the novel. But basically, he's really grateful to be Jekyll again. The next day came the news that the murder had been overlooked, so no one's been able to find him, that the guilt of Hyde was patent to the world, and that the victim was a man high in public estimation. So remember, people care about the death of Carew because he was a kind of he was an MP and he was a very famous person. It was not only a crime; it had been a tragic folly. Folly means kind of like foolishness. I think I was glad to know it. I think I was glad to have my better impulses thus buttressed and guarded by the terrors of the scaffold. Jekyll was now my city of refuge. So Hyde, the murderer, hides inside the city. It's a lovely metaphor, actually. Hiding behind this city for safety. Let but Hyde peep out an instant, and the hands of all men will be raised to take and slay him, to kill him. If Hyde is found, he's a dead man. I resolved in my future conduct to redeem the past. So he's going to sort of make up for the bad things he's done for this murder. And I can say with honesty that my resolve was fruitful of some good. You know yourself how earnestly in the last months of last year I laboured to relieve suffering, like charity. He became a charitable man to try and get rid of the guilt. You know that much was done for others and that the days passed quietly, almost happily for myself. So he does find some happiness being Jekyll again. Nor can I truly say that I wearied of this beneficent and innocent life. I think instead that I daily enjoyed it more completely, but I was still cursed with my duality of purpose. Remember, he's cursed with this duality of purpose. Duality, the most important theme in the book. The idea that there's two sides to every person, and he feels cursed by it. He feels cursed that he's got a good side and a bad side. And as the first edge of my penitence wore off, the lower side of me, so long indulged, so recently chained down, began to growl for license, so Hyde wants to come out again. Not that I dreamed of resuscitating Hyde. The bare idea of that would startle me to frenzy. No, it was in my own person that I was once more tempted to trifle with my conscience. And it was as an ordinary secret sinner that I at last fell before the assaults of temptation. So this chapter he's been flip-flopping between Hyde and Jekyll, but he gives in to temptation and he becomes Hyde again. There comes to an end to all things. The most capacious measure is filled at last, and this brief condescension to my evil, and this is really key, finally destroyed the balance of my soul. Really good quote. So it was this decision to become Hyde for one last time that finally destroyed the balance. And Stevenson's almost saying that we all live in a balance of maintaining the good side of ourselves and the bad. But by becoming the bad side solely, Jekyll was able to kind of destroy that balance. And yet I was not alarmed. The fall seemed natural, like a return to the old days before I'd made my discovery. So he feels like it's kind of a natural thing, even though it's very unnatural, obviously. It was a fine, clear January day, wet underfoot where the frost had melted, but cloudless overhead. Some sort of pathetic fallacy there, that all is well. And the Regent's Park, which is a park in London, was full of winter chirrupings and sweet with spring odours. I sat in the sun on a bench, the animal within me licking the chops of memory, the spiritual side a little drowsed, promising subsequent penitence, but not yet moved to begin. After all, I reflected I was like my neighbours, and then I smiled. So by the way, he's not become Hyde yet, he's about to. He's just describing the day that he became him again. After all, I reflected I was like my neighbours. And by the way, his neighbours are the readers. He's saying, you know what, I'm the same as everyone else. And he smiles. Comparing myself with other men, comparing my active goodwill with the lazy cruelty of their neglect. He's critical of other people. He says that they are lazy, they're cruel, and they neglect what's important in life. And so this could be Stevenson criticising the people of Victorian London, not doing enough perhaps to help the poor. And at the very moment of that vainglorious thought, a qualm came over me, a horrid nausea and the most deadly shuddering. So nausea, he feels kind of sick. It suddenly comes over him. These passed away and left me faint. And then, as in its turn the faintness subsided, I began to be aware of a change in the temper of my thoughts, a greater boldness, a contempt of danger. These are all his thoughts changing. A solution of the bonds of obligation. I looked down. My clothes hung formlessly on my shrunken limbs. The hand that lay on my knee was corded and hairy, so something wrong with his hand. look again. I was once more Edward Hyde. So again, we get this description. He's short. He kind of is disgusting looking. A moment before, I had been safe of all men's respect, wealthy, beloved. So he'd been someone who just was a respectful Victorian gentleman. The cloth laying for me in the dining room at home, and now I was the common quarry of mankind, kind of like the depths of mankind. Hunted, houseless, a known murderer, thrall to the gallows. The gallows was where he'd be hanged. So he's now become a murderer, wanted to be hanged by everyone. So he's become Hyde in a park now, and he's completely lost control of his ability to turn, into one or the other. My reason wavered, but it did not fail me utterly. I have more than once observed that, in my second character, my faculties seem sharpened. So when he feels like Hyde, he feels like his senses and his instincts are sharpened to a point, and my spirits more tensely elastic. Thus it came about that, where Jekyll perhaps might have succumbed, Hyde rose to the importance of the moment. So Hyde is actually able to deal with this difficult circumstance of becoming Hyde in the park. My drugs were in one of the presses of my cabinet. Remember that his presses are like a drawer. How was I to reach them? That was the problem that, crushing my temples in my hands, I set myself to solve. The laboratory door I had closed. If I sought to enter by the house, my own servants would consign me to the gallows. So he knows that actually, even if his servants saw him, they would send him to be hanged. I saw I must employ another hand, and thought of Lanyon. Now we understand. This links very much into the last chapter, where we had Lanyon's narrative. We're now getting the reasoning behind why Hyde needed him. How was he to be reached? How persuaded? Supposing that I escaped capture in the streets, how was I to make my way into his presence? And how should I, an unknown and displeasing visitor, prevail on the famous physician to rifle the study of his colleague, Dr. Jekyll? Then I remembered that of my original character, one part remained to me. I could write my own hand. So even if he's Jekyll or Hyde, his handwriting he's able to kind of write like that, although it's slightly different. And once I conceived the kindling spark, the way that I must follow became lighted up from end to end. Remember, we're going to know in this next, we know from the previous chapter basically what happens next. This all links to Lanyon's narrative. Anyway, that's the end of this part of the book. There's only 4 pages to go.